Since I recorded color management, there's been some major changes with how Redshift deals with color. As a matter of fact, the entire workflow is overhauled. And so don't be distressed though, because everything I just taught you is still useful and applies to your own knowledge and understanding what's going on here. However, things have drastically changed. So I want to show you how to get by on this now. So what I'm using here is Redshift 3.0.49. If you have that version or later, then when you pull up an old scene, you'll notice that everything is pretty bad. It's giving you all kinds of errors. It's freaking out. Now, the first thing I'd like to point out here is that we are used to bringing in the OCIO config through the environment variable like this. And you can still do that. However, I would recommend not doing that anymore, because what Redshift now does is it brings in its own OCIO config out of the box. And specifically the OCIO version 2, which has features that the previous version did not. And so if we go here to our out context, we can get rid of these guys because they're old render output nodes. Let's go ahead and make a new Redshift render settings. And if we go to Redshift and we go to System and we scroll down, we have this new section right here that defines the OCIO rendering space and where it's reading in the config. Now, by default, it's going for the path that I've set in this environment variable. So let me actually bring up this guy. So if you bring it in like normal, like that, if you don't bypass it, then it's just going to read it directly like this. However, if there's nothing in the environment variable, then let me restart Houdini and show you what happens. After restarting Houdini and bypassing that OCIO config, we've now set this to scene linear Rec 709 sRGB, and it's now reading the OCIO config from the Redshift program data folder. And this now tells me that I'm using OCIO version 2 because that's what ships with Redshift. But what's the deal with this OCIO rendering space, and why is that scene linear Rec 709 sRGB? Well, remember back to when I said, okay, we bring in the OCIO and that tells Redshift how it needs to understand color, how it's now going to use the wide gamut. Well, that was not completely true. In the old versions of Redshift, it did not use the ACES gamut for color picking. It did not use it for any color that you selected within a color swatch in Houdini. It was not true for, let's say, hair melanin. It was not true for all kinds of different things. The physical sun and sky, none of it was using ACES with the ACES CG gamuts with those colors. And so now with these new versions of Redshift, we can actually say, yes, I want everything you think about, the scene referred space, to think about everything in ACES CG. So be sure that your OCIO rendering space is set to ACES CG so that Redshift works with that wider range of primaries. So if you have ACES CG and you have the config, that's the OCIO version 2, then that's what you're looking for to get started. Now, this use OCIO file rules is something that you can check on if you'd like to create extra file rules within the OCIO config file. If you want to create a custom setup and read file rules from the OCIO files, then you want to check that on. And this right here, the transform input colors to OCIO rendering space, basically takes any colors you select in sRGB and transforms them into ACES CG space when Redshift goes to think about the colors. So if you have the ACES CG up here and you have this config down here, then you want to leave on that transform input colors to OCIO, because that will now take your color picker and your shader settings that are just colors and transform them into this ACES CG rendering space. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense. Now, another thing that you'll need to do is change the cameras. So I just have one camera right here. If I go to Redshift on the little tabs up here, we can then just click on this cam params, and that will update this camera. Now with this, we now have an OCIO post effects tab right here. And what's interesting about this is that you'll notice that we only have sRGB. This OCIO display, same thing right here, is asking you what kind of monitor are you using to preview the scene referred data. In other words, if we go back up here, we know that Redshift is thinking about things in ACES CG, but it needs to show you colors based on what your monitor is trying to do. So if we go back up here to Cam 1, right now we only have the option of sRGB, but in the future that ought to expand. You ought to be able to select more monitors. For right now, it's just where the devs are currently at with sRGB. Now, this view down here is kind of interesting because we have a few different options. I recommend keeping ACES 1.0 SDR video for most situations. That is going to apply basically a gamma curve correction to make the tone mapping more appealing. So this is kind of more of an artistic choice right here, but you don't have to tone map at all. You can leave that untone mapped, or you could say raw as an example to just see the raw data of something. So anyway, for most situations, sRGB ACES 1 SDR video for the transform right here, or for the gamma curve transform, that's usually going to be what you want for most situations. So let's try to re-render this, see if we can load our new camera. Looks like it loaded right there nicely. That's great. In the next video, let's take a gander at the different color space options that you'll find on lights and textures.